Okay, very good. Okay, so we've got the sheet looks a little bit different this week. I I tried to make like a chart on the on. There were all these ways to make charts. So this took me it took me a long time. So I'm very proud of the fact that I made a little bit of a chart. So what happens is we have a very famous verse that I chose. It's the end of the first Aliyah in this week's parsha, and and the pasuk is has become famous because it's the source of this famous rabbinic idea that that the avot, that our patriarchs and matriarchs kept the entire Torah before it was given. That's the way actually the Midrash words it. Kimu at the Torah lifnei shekiblu, that they kept it before the Torah had been given at Har Sinai, and it's based on this particular verse. So let's take a look at the verse. The first word akev deserves its own class, and a couple of years ago we actually did have an entire class on the word akev because it's the first word in Parshat Akev in Devarim. I just took the JPS translation that was on Sefaria, which is inasmuch. Akev means because of, in light of, things of that nature. But okay, so Akev, inasmuch, Asher Shama Avram B'Koli. So God is telling Yitzchak, this is actually the only time in the Torah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that God actually speaks to Yitzchak Avinu. All the time, you know, we have a bunch with Avram. We're going to have a bunch with Yaakov, but with Yitzchak, this is it. And so but in this talk to him, he tells Yitzchak how Avraham, Yitzchak's father, kept God's Torah, God's instructions. Okay, so let's take a look at it. So since Avram listened to everything that God said, the previous verse says that a lot of promises were made that are going to be fulfilled in the future because Avraham did what? Listened to the voice of God. Shema b'koli, heard my, capital M, my voice. Obeyed me is this translation. Shema b'koli literally means listen to my voice. And then the second half, vayishmor, and kept. Mishmarti, again, the translation says my charge. Next, mitzvotai, my commandments. Chukotai, my laws. And the last one, vitorotai, my teachings. So 4 things. God made a tremendous deal with Yitzchak and the future generations of that family that becomes the Jewish nation because of the scrupulous nature of Avraham listening to everything that God said. Now, in this little chart, I took the 4 terms: mishmarti, my charge; mitzvotai, my commandments; chukotai, my laws; Torah-tai, my teachings. I took those 4 terms and gave 4 different interpretations. Rashi, who is the most famous, follows the Midrash, which says that the Avot, the patriarchs, followed the Torah, kept the Torah before it was given. In spite of the fact that the Torah wasn't officially given, they kept it. How did they keep it? Ruach HaKodesh, some sort of divine inspiration, prophecy. Maybe God sent them certain hints. We don't know exactly, but they kept it, is the Midrash's point. And so Rashi says that mishmatar means precautionary measures. In other words, um, that not only did he keep the mitzvot, but he made sure that he didn't even, get close to keeping the mitzvot. Just to give you an example of a precautionary measure, think about making tea on Shabbos. It's prohibited to take a tea bag and put it in a boiling pot of water on the fire, on the heat source. That's cooking from the Torah. Let's say I pour the hot water into a cup and I put the tea bag into that cup. That's called kli, it's the second level. That is the precautionary measure the rabbi said to stop us from cooking, that the Torah prohibited. We have a rabbinic level of cooking we're not supposed to do, called a second level utensil, kli. When you get, what we do is we pour it into a third cup, a third container, and then we put the tea bag in. Kli shlishi is permitted. But the precautionary is the added rabbinic stricture not to use that second level of talk. Okay, mitzvotai are the logical laws, like don't steal, don't murder, those kinds of laws that if God hadn't given them in the Torah, we would make them up ourselves, like almost every society does. Chukotai are those famous mitzvot that we don't understand, like keeping kosher. We don't really understand. Wearing, the prohibition against wearing shatnez is linen and wool combined clothing is prohibited. So those are chukotai. The mitzvot we don't really understand, but we keep them anyways. And Torotai means both the written Torah and the oral. Torotai is in the plural. My Torot. So Rashi and the Midrash explain that means both the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the oral Torah, which is the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Midrash. Okay, that's Rashi. That's the most famous position, which is saying that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and all of the Jews that were part of that, that tradition until Mount Sinai kept the Torah, even though it hadn't yet been actually given. That's Rashi. The Ibn Ezra says no. He is a literal commentary on the text, and he doesn't want to follow the Midrash. He says, Mishmartai means mitzvot that Avraham was specifically commanded to do. There were some mitzvot that he got from Hashem, and those those mitzvot that he got from Hashem. It's not going to be Brit Milah, but other things that God told him along the way. There were a small number of mitzvot that he said, don't steal, don't murder, whatever. There were a number of mitzvot. That's what that was. The mitzvotai were specific instructions unique to Avraham. Lech lecha, leave your land and go to Eretz Yisrael. The Akedah, take your son and sacrifice him on Ha Moriah, on the place I will show you. So there were times when God told Avram to do something very specific. That's mitzvotai. Chukotai is fascinating, according to the Ibn Ezra. Chukotai means Avraham, in his conversations, in his interactions with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, saw or intuited, understood certain behavior patterns from Hashem. Love, compassion, empathy, caring. That he saw that God had these attributes. So chukotai means he did those things too. He became a person who really cared about humanity because he saw that in God. And then Torotai means big mitzvot that are complicated. Not like, don't steal, But complicated things like keep Shabbat, and the big one that he talks about is Brit Milah, and how you have to learn exactly how to do it. It's very technical. Then you have to pass it on. So that's Torah. Torah is these complicated laws. So that's the Ibn Ezra. The Sforno, on the other hand, has a totally different approach to this. He said the first one, Mishmarti, means actually what the Ibn Ezra called Chukotai. Those are trying to imitate o Dei, to copy God, to emulate the divine behavior, be a good person, and again, empathy, sympathy, all of that. But the other three, mitzvotai, chukotai, toratai, are the 7 Noahide laws. Some of the 7 are mitzvot. Some of them, like don't steal and don't kill. Some of them are chukotai that aren't as easily understood, like specifically aver minachah. You can't eat animal. You can't eat flesh from an animal that's still alive. Apparently, in the ancient world, people were very poor, and let's say you had a cow, a bull, an ox, that you might periodically actually carve some of the meat out of the hide of the animal while he's alive and keep him alive. And by the time that heals, you do it again. And we said that's disgusting, and we prohibited, but that's already prohibited for Gentiles, and that's chukotai. And the last one, toratai, would be that they had to come up with a legal system. The 7th of the 7 Noahide laws is to set up courts and a legal system. That's toratai. Okay. And the last one that I used there, by the way, there are many people that have different versions of what the 4 are, but most of them sort of follow the pattern of these 4. The last one on the list is also the last one to have written on the topic, which is the Or HaChaim, who died in 1750. And he said Mishmarti means that he passed all of the tests. We believe that God tested Abraham 10 times, like the labors of Hercules, that Abraham, who lived before Hercules, also went through tests. Lech Lecha was a test. The Akedah was a test. Having to go to Egypt and remaining loyal was a test. Everything, a lot of the stories are called tests. So that's Mishmarti. Mitzvotai means be careful not to sin. By sin, we not only mean the 7 Noahide laws, but other things that he perceived to be wrong. Chukotai is that there were a number of things like eating flesh from a living animal and whatever that he already didn't do, that didn't have an apparent reason, but he listened to what God said. And toratai means that all of these laws and ideas that he got from Hashem, he would sit and study them. Torah means study in this Or HaChaim. And that he would not just study all of these things that God said to him, he would teach them to anyone who would listen. Number one, to his children, of course, grandchildren, but mostly to all of those people that found the ideas of Avram Avinu very exciting. So those are different ways to deal with the 4 terms in our text. If you follow what we just read, it's only Rashi who claims that the Avot, starting with Avraham, kept all of the mitzvot. The others sort of say, yeah, they kept some things, but not everything. Okay. What's the truth? We don't know. But the Ramban, and we're going to see this gets repeated a little bit later, slightly differently. The Ramban says that there's a problem. Even though he accepts Rashi and the Midrash's opinion that they kept all the mitzvot, the Ramban noticed that that presents us with a bit of a dilemma. What's that dilemma? Now, if so, all this interpretation is posited on the opinion that Avraham, fulfilled and observed the Torah before it was given on Sinai. This is indeed what the sages in the Midrash said in connection, not here, but it's later when there's a famous Midrash that Yosef sent agalot, wagons, to Yaakov. Why? To indicate to his father that when he left him, they were studying the section dealing with Egel Arufa. A word for a wagon, agalah, is like the word for a calf, egla. So he's saying they were learning Torah. And this was a hint to the last sugya the last Torah topic that they had covered before before Yosef was sold into slavery. Thus, Joseph occupied himself with Torah just as his fathers did. Though the Torah had not yet been given, it is still written concerning Avraham, our verse. And he kept my charge, my commandments, my statute, my laws. Based on our verse, even though this Ramban was really written later on in the Torah, the other sages also said that Avram observed the details of the Torah, which he's taught to his children, etc. Okay. But now there's a problem. What's the problem? The question presents itself. There's a problem that arises. If it be the case that the laws of the Torah were observed by ancestors before the Torah was given on Sinai, how did Jacob erect a pillar? Next week, he's going to have a dream, and after the dream, he's going to put up a matzeva. He's going to put up. We use that word to mean a tombstone, but they use that word to mean like a pillar, and we're not allowed to do that. Those pillars ended up being worshipped by idolaters, and we're not supposed to do that. That's something that later the Torah is going to prohibit. And he married two sisters in their lifetime. He marries Rachel and he marries Leah. Well, out of order. He marries Leah, then he marries Rachel, and they're both alive. That's asur. The only time, according to the Torah, you can marry a sister is, God forbid, you marry a sister, she passes away, and then you marry the surviving sister. That's permitted. But you can't even divorce one and marry the second. That all of that is prohibited. So how could he do it? And in the there's another midrash that somehow the other two shvachot were also sisters, but we're not going to go there. Okay. Also, Amram, the father of Moshe, marries his aunt Yocheved, according to the way we read the genealogy in chapter 6 of Shemot. It sounds like she was his aunt. That's asur. An uncle can marry a niece, but an aunt can't marry a nephew. The Torah prohibits it. Why exactly? I mean, that's a sugya in chapter 18 of Vayikra. But it's a prohibition. It's one of the arayot. It's one of the prohibited couples. And Moshe, our teacher, erected 12 pillars before the Jews came into Eretz Yisrael. How could they do these things which the Torah doesn't allow? Now, the last one is not a good example because God says to do it. Notice, God has the right to abrogate his own laws on a special occasion. It's called Hara'at Sha'ah. It was a temporary abrogation of the law. When God says it, like most famous example of that is when Eliyahu Hanavi brings that korban, that sacrifice, together with the prophets of Baal in Haifa. He does it in Har HaKarmel in Haifa. That's asur. You can't bring sacrifices outside the Beit HaMikdash. It's not supposed to do that. So how could he do it? Hashem gave him a special instruction just this once. Listen to me. It's an emergency. Do this. And so this last case since God seems to have told, not so clear, but seems to have told Moshe to do it. So the last case isn't as good, but all the other cases are great. Now, it appears to me from a study of the opinions of our rabbis that Avraham, our father, learned the entire Torah by Ruach HaKodesh. He agrees that they kept the Torah. He's not going to back down on Rashi and the Midrash's position, and occupied himself with its study and the reasons for its commandments and its secrets. Oh, those secrets. Okay. And he observed it in its entirety as one who is not commanded, but nevertheless observed it. So who is someone who's not commanded, but nevertheless observes it? Children, people who are learning to become converts. And so those people are expected to keep mitzvot, but if they don't, there's no downside. They don't get punished for it. It's not an avera. It's not a sin. So our ancestors kept the mitzvot, but they didn't have to. Since they weren't obligated, if once in a while they broke a rule, it was okay. It was okay. Okay, but he's going to say something better in a second. Furthermore, his observance of the Torah, or I don't know what it says his, it should be their observance of the Torah, applied only in the land of Eretz Yisrael. Whereas Jacob married two sisters only when outside the land. And this is one of the saddest things I'm going to say in any class. According to this opinion, that's why Rachel dies immediately upon re-entering Eretz Yisrael, because he can't have two wives in Eretz Yisrael. They only kept the mitzvahs in Eretz Yisrael. So Amram can marry his aunt Yocheved in Egypt. And in Egypt, they didn't necessarily have to keep Shabbat or Kashrut, whatever. But when you're in Eretz Yisrael, you have to keep it. This is one of the famous Zionistic positions of the Ramban. The Ramban later in Vayikra says, actually, even today, most mitzvot are only obligatory in Eretz Yisrael. If you're keeping them outside of Eretz Yisrael, you're in, Gail, you're in Silver Spring, Maryland. It's voluntary. It's voluntary in Maryland, and in Muncie and Lakewood and Borough Park. We don't really hold by that position, but the Ramban says it very strongly in Sefer Vayikra. Okay, so that's how the Ramban gets out of the problem. It's a very famous answer, that they did have to keep the mitzvah, but only in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbeinu Bechaye brings up another issue. It's going to be mentioned again, but he brings that more fully. I should have just blocked it out later, and I made a mistake. Okay, because Avram was obedient to me. Excuse me. This is the source of our sages in Devarim claiming that Avram recognized his maker when he was only 3 years old. There's a famous Gemara, and a lot of commentaries say it. When did Avram Avinu discover God? So they say, when he was 3 years old. Really? 3 years old? The Rambam has another tradition that he really only discovered God when he was 40. But the Rambam, Maimonides, puts the two together. He said he started searching as a little child at the age of 3, but he finally became a full believer in ethical monotheism, in one God who created everything and demands us to be good people, when he was 40. So it was a process of 37 years. But many people say that he did it at the age of 3. Why the age of 3? There is an opinion that the age of 3 is called the age of Gemul, of becoming responsible for your actions. So a lot of people say that you shouldn't even really try to get kids to do mitzvot before they're 3. I mean, you can practice a little bit, but it's like they do it, but if they don't do it, you don't get upset. Now, as if they eat, if they, they dip their hot dog into milk before they're 3, you tell them not to do it, but you sort of let them get away with it. Once they're 3, we start to, you know, mold them and we start to move them. So 3 is like a borderline for being, a baby who doesn't really get it to starting to be responsible for your behavior. So that's why they say it 3. Okay. But here's another reason why we say 3. Okay. He had lived 175 years. Avram lived to be 175. We learned that last week. When you add up the numerical letters in the word at the beginning of our verse, Akev, you get 172. If you deduct this number from 175, the resulting number is 3. That's the number of years when Avram was not yet obeying God's commandments because he had not yet recognized God as such. So in other words, Avram, Akev means before, that was the time that he fulfilled the mitzvah. So he fulfilled the mitzvah 172 years out of 175. And so that must mean he discovered God on his own at the age of 3. Okay. Okay. It's very famous and it's very cute and it's very, very nice. So the Rabbeinu Bechaye goes on to describe his interpretation for the 4 levels, but it's really things that we sort of covered up above. So I'm gonna stop the Rabbeinu Bechaye at this point. Okay. The Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, who is a Talmud of the Rambam and lives a little bit earlier, slightly earlier than the Ramban. They overlapped, and he's more of a very, like the Rambam, a much more rational approach as opposed to Rabbeinu Bechaye, who's a student of the Ramban, and the Ramban himself, both of whom are sort of mystical in their approach to things. So the Radak writes, God included all the commandments in our verse, hinting that all the commandments, that is, chukotai, contain elements of which the rational has been revealed and some which have not. So the kinds of mitzvot. So chukotai is a certain type. Even the 7 Noahide laws on the second side, applicable universally, contain elements, the reason for which has not ever been revealed to the people, but whose rationale is familiar only to the wisest scholars. So some of the things like a rayot, keeping laws of family purity and of modesty, regular people don't get exactly why we have these things, but scholars do. Avim and Achai, again, eating flesh from an animal that's still alive. Regular people say, what's wrong with that? Who cares? It's a dumb animal. Well, scholars would say we understand it. So that's the point of the Radak is some of these mitzvot are not understandable to regular people, but there are always scholars who are going to understand everything. Okay. Examples of such commandments: a prohibition of grafting, crossbreeding, eating amputated limbs of a living animal, Avim and Achai. To describe such laws, the Torah here mentions chukotai, my statutes, whereas the description mitzvotai refers to the commandments which the human mind does understand and even applauds and is happy. Oh, I'm glad there's a mitzvah, to be kind. I'm glad there's a mitzvah to remember the Exodus from Egypt. These are nice mitzvot that make a lot of sense, and therefore, wow, great, I applaud it. Okay. It matters not that these commandments be performed by different parts of the body, sometimes in the mouth, reciting Shema, the hands, putting on tefillin, or merely the heart. Similarly, it matters not whether they are positive commandments requiring actions or negative commandments requiring self-restraint. But all of those mitzvot are very, very powerful. And therefore, that's why we have the list of all the different kinds of mitzvot, because each type or area of Jewish law enforces or reinforces different kinds of ideas and behavior patterns, and all of them have a very important place because we want Torah to control our body and actions, to control our minds and our thoughts and guide us to be scholarly and intelligent, but also to guide our emotions. So we've got actions and emotions and thoughts. Um, and we want all of them to fit into this rubric, to fit into this entire system. And that's what's going on in our verse. And I think that's a very beautiful approach. I'm going to skip the rest of the Radak because he repeats some things in the Ramban. Okay. I want to go over to the Nefesh HaChaim. Now, the Nefesh HaChaim, and I'm a little embarrassed here because I'm going to read to you from what I should have put on the page rather than this version of it, which I took from Safaria, really isn't written very well. I mean, just when you start to read it, rather it says, "I wrote previously at the end of Gate 1 that they fulfilled the Torah's result of their grasping via their wondrous understanding of how the worlds are rectified." I don't know what that means. I mean, why would anybody write like that? What he means is he's talking about tikkun. Rectified means tikkun, fixing things, getting things right, because many things in the world aren't. And the purpose of most of the mitzvot is to make the world a better place. And I'm going to read to you, and bring that, I'll make a copy of it and I'll send it. So people that want to see this on their own later will be able to do that. I'll put it on the WhatsApp group later tonight. And I apologize. I should have given the better version of the Nefesh HaChaim. His idea is beautiful, but this version of it is a little garbled. And I gave in to just cutting and pasting it from Safaria when I should have gone to a better translation. So here is the Nefesh HaChaim. Now, who is the Nefesh HaChaim? The Nefesh HaChaim is Reb Chaim Volozhin, who was the most famous student of the Vilna Gaon. Now, the Vilna Gaon died in 1798, and a few years later, in 1708, I believe, but in the beginning of the 1807, not 1708, it's 1807. The student, the Reb Chaim Volozhin, leaves Vilna and goes to the small town in Lithuania called Volozhin and starts a yeshiva. That yeshiva in Volozhin, which existed from approximately 1807 till 1896, was the prototype of the Lithuanian yeshiva. To this day, many yeshivot, whether we're talking about the Mir or Lakewood or any of the famous yeshivot, Slobodka, are following a lot of the pedagogic ideas laid down by Reb Chaim. But Reb Chaim was not only a great halachist and Talmudist, he was also a bit of a philosopher. And he wrote this beautiful work called Nefesh HaChaim to try to explain a lot of very mystical, esoteric ideas. And he does it in a beautiful way, which is a shame because on the page in front of you, it doesn't come out so beautiful. It comes up pretty garbled. And I'm embarrassed that I was lazy yesterday and didn't go to a better source. But I'm going to read to you now what he said. It's just 2 paragraphs. One may ask, which we already did, this is the same question as the Ramban. One may ask, if the patriarchs, the Avot, kept the entire Torah, how could Yaakov marry 2 sisters? How could Amram marry his aunt? We talked about that. Joining into unions that are forbidden by Torah law. Yaakov discerned. Listen to what he's saying. It's not like the Ramban. He did it because he wasn't in Eretz Yisrael. No. Yaakov understood, discerned, figured out that according to the root of his neshama, very mystical idea. What's the root of your neshama? That is in that little piece of divinity that's in you that is anchored all the way up to heaven. So in the root of his neshama, in the higher world, heaven, would benefit greatly if he married both Rachel and Leah. He knew, because he was such a spiritual person, that somehow this world required him to marry both Rachel and Leah and the Shvachot, Bilhah and Zilpah, because he had to have the 12 sons who were going to be Shivtei God, the 12 holy tribes of Israel. Okay? He understood that the two sisters were destined to be the mothers of the house of Yisrael, Beit Yisrael. For this reason, he was willing to suffer the hardship of slaving for the devious Lavan day and night for 20 years to be able to marry them both. Similarly, Amram married his aunt Yocheved because he knew that she was destined to be the mother of Moshe, Aharon, and Miriam, the future leaders of Yisrael. So even though they were required to keep the Torah, if they knew through some type of Ruach HaKodesh, some sort of divine spirit, some sort of understanding of a special situation which was developing, they could avoid keeping the Torah. So special circumstances, they understood, which is sort of like the special circumstances for Eliyahu. But instead of God telling Eliyahu to do it, they did it on their own. And Hashem said, yeah, eventually. How do we know that Hashem said, yeah, I agree? Because they did become the 12 tribes of Israel. And because Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam did become the leaders of the Jewish people. This is also one of the reasons why the Torah wasn't physically given to the patriarchs. If they had received the Torah physically, Yaakov would not have been allowed to marry the two sisters, nor could Amram have married his aunt. Even if they understood that by judging the roots of their neshama, looking deeply into their souls, this would be highly beneficial to the world, they still couldn't do it because the Torah had been given, ratified, and became 100% effective. This would be, indeed, the marriages of Yaakov and Amram were the foundations of the house of Israel and the factors that set right all the upper and lower worlds. It worked both for Olam Hazeh, this physical world down here, and the upper Olam Haba, spiritual realm way up there. That both this world and heaven, so to speak, and Shemayim required them to bend these rules. I guess break these rules. But they couldn't have done it if the Torah was given. So God gave them the Torah in Ruach HaKodesh in some form of prophecy, divine messages. And so they kept it generally, but it was possible to break the rules because it wasn't yet binding. That's why Hashem didn't give it physically yet. As to the fact that Cain married his sister, well, that was before anything anyways, but he says that was done because the world is built on kindness, as Cain needed a kindness to marry his sister because they were the only humans. So, I mean, sometimes the world has to exist. So that was like a different situation, a special situation. But also, we don't believe that Cain and Adam had the whole Torah. They just had 7 mitzvot. But one of those 7 mitzvot was don't marry close relatives. But that was before they got the 7 mitzvot, because those 7 mitzvot were only given when Noah came around. So bli neder, I will make a copy of this and send it out, because the way it's on the page is garbled. Okay. So ever since the day Moshe brought the Torah down to earth, it is no longer in heaven. Therefore, no man, no matter how great his understanding, may permit him to say, according to my understanding of the root of my soul, I may violate a certain mitzvah, or neglect a certain detail, or change a certain performance. So in other words, once the Torah is given, you can't play these games that we just talked about, that especially the prime examples are Yaakov and Amram. I shouldn't have called them games, that you can't bend the rules when it looks like it would be good. The exception to that, of course, is a prophecy like Eliyahu, or someone puts a gun in your back and says, eat that ham sandwich. So there are, even in our present world, exceptions to this idea of keeping all the mitzvot all the time. But again, those are special and very unusual circumstances. Okay, that's a beautiful idea. So why did they keep the mitzvot? Because the world benefited from it. Listen to what Rav Judah Goldberg. Again, this is as often on the sheets. Some of my favorite things come from Rav Steinsaltz, or come from Rabbi Sachs. Both of them, Aleichem Shalom, or blessed memory. But if it's not from them, it usually comes from the Yeshiva Torah Tzion website, and that's true tonight also. He is going to explain the situation of how they kept Torah but didn't really keep Torah. And I think what he's going to say is very, very useful and very beautiful. Okay. So he's asking the same question. They had the Torah and they kept it. So how did they break it? And did they really have it? He says, no, that's not the issue. The issue is different. The answer, I believe, this is the last comment on the page. The answer, I believe, highlights a key distinction between Brit Sinai, the covenant at the foot of Mount Sinai, and Brit Avot, the covenants, in the plural, made by the Avot. The major covenant of the Avot was Brit Bein HaBetarim, the covenant between the parts, back in chapter 15. But we believe Yitzchak makes his own covenant, and we believe that Yaakov makes his own. So it's not just Brit, it's Britot, the covenants made by the patriarchs. At the heart of Brit Sinai lies laws. The covenant at Sinai was judicial. At the heart of Brit Avot lies values. Brit Sinai was mostly in the brain. Brit Avot was mostly in the heart. What both of them are about controlling our behavior. One is very didactic and very punctilious. Do this, don't do that. While the other is very general and is describing an overall type of behavior pattern rather than specific behaviors. Okay? Brit Sinai takes the form of a contract. Fixed expectations are set. Rigid conditions are stipulated, and pre-specified penalties are comprehensively described. Wow, I like that sentence. That's a good sentence. It closely resembles, in fact, the interhuman britot of Sefer Bereshit. Sometimes, when you read some of the the laws and the way they're given, not so much at the Ten Commandments, but in Sefer Mishpatim. I mean, not Sefer, Parshat Mishpatim, and later Parshat Titetze, they come with sort of like stories to them, and they're describing behavior patterns. I mean, sometimes they just like get stated, but sometimes they get, a little bit. But when we see that they're sort of described, it closely resembles, in fact, the interhuman britot of Sefer Bereshit, of the covenants made by the Avot, by the patriarchs, which resemble classic contractual agreements. I mean, the format of what we would call a handshake with God is some sort of covenantal agreement. The bringing of a korban, cutting animals in half and making a sacrifice out of them, or building an altar, things of that nature. So what happens is, represent classic contractual agreements. Two parties identify a common interest. By the way, that's also in this week's parsha. In Toldot, we also have the contracts made between Yitzchak and Avimelech, and handshakes and covenants, even though they may each approach it from a different vantage point. They don't necessarily have the same idea on what they're getting out of this agreement. Two parties identify a common interest, even though they may each approach it from a different vantage point. I just read that. They need not embrace a common shared vision. Yitzhak and Avimelech don't. And they may maintain neutral or even adversarial stances towards each other. We're going to see that next week with Yaakov and Lavan. They make a deal, but they don't really like each other. And the same thing with Esav the week after that in Vayishlach. They make a covenant and a deal. They don't really like each other, but they do it for practical reasons. They need not embrace a common shared vision, and they may maintain neutral, even adversarial stances toward each other. The contract may hope for or even encourage greater mutual participation, but it does not count on it. Or at the very least, it anticipates fluctuations over time and thus protects each party in the event of respectful distance, whether transient or fixed. The contracts made in Bereshit between Avraham and Avimelech, between Yitzchak and Avimelech, between Avram and Paro, all of these contracts that are made with these different people, what they set a floor. We're not going to be nastier than this to each other, but there's no ceiling. We don't say, oh, we're trying to be the best of friends. No, we're trying to prevent violence between you and me. We're trying to stop bloodshed. But they don't talk about how great it could be for the relationship, which is exactly why its terms are so specific and its penalties are so harsh. Brit, the voting contract, constitutes what we would more probably call a covenant in its most literal sense. A covenant denotes not merely an agreement, but a union of sorts between the participants. They bond around a common vision, a shared purpose, which inspires their mission. The covenant certainly imposes obligations upon each party, but these obligations emerge naturally from the core principles that the participants jointly embrace, rather than formal stipulations introduced by each side. Whereas a contract, like the later covenants in Sinai and later, sets terms. You do this, I do that. You're good, you'll get rewarded. You're bad, you'll get punished. It sets terms. A covenant determines expectations. God says, I make a covenant with you, Avraham. Your children are going to be like the stars in the heaven. It's expectations. Covenants are much more beautiful than contracts. Most of the time in our lives, we make contracts, buying a house, starting a business. But some of our most important relationships are covenants. I think our marriages are covenants. Yes, there are agreements on, especially in the tuba, but it's mostly about, wow, this is going to be wonderful together. And I think that's the way we have to look at the difference between from Sinai on and from before the end of Breshit to earlier. That when we have covenants, not that we don't have covenants later, britot with God. At Mount Sinai is also a brit. And before the Jews go into Eretz Yisrael, there's also a brit. But the nature of Torah after Mount Sinai is mostly a contract, while all of the beautiful things described in our verse, and there are many levels to them, Chukotai, Torah, Mishmarot, many levels to them, but they're not a contract, they're a covenant. And they're less about obligations and more about vision. And that's what we look at when we learn Sefer Bereshit, the vision, the joint vision of God together with our patriarchs that we try to keep and fulfill. So yes, the Avot did acts. That's what the verse is talking about. But the purpose of the acts wasn't like later, you do this, you'll be rewarded, you do that, you'll be punished, like we have at the end of Vayikra, and again, at the end of Devarim. It's more about do this, and the world will be the kind of place we both want it to be. So I think that Rav Goldberg here at the end really hit the nail on the head, that we have to see Torah mostly is about a lot of nitty gritty, what can you do on Shabbos, and what can you eat, and what can't you do on a holiday, and what can't you eat, and all that stuff. And it's important and necessary to control our human behavior patterns. But Breshit and our pasuk isn't about that kind of a balanced scale weighing. It's about just looking up to the heavens and having a vision of how wonderful things can be if we just fulfill our side of the bargain. And that's what we're talking about in Bereshit, how wonderful it can be. And of course, especially under our present circumstances, we pray that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will help us see how wonderful things can be, hopefully very, very soon. And what we have to do is just keep up that vision. Nice comment here, hoping for a contract between nations. Amen. Yeah, our covenants with God, with nations, we need contract, and we could use those right now too. Thank you. True. We keep hearing, I was saying this before we got on the line, we keep hearing about, a deal is on the way. Okay, I'm still waiting. I don't know about you guys. Okay, but let's just keep that vision. That's what we're supposed to take away from this. Not so much obligations, but just have the idea of how wonderful it can be. And hopefully it will be. Be Meir of Yameinu very, very soon. Thank you all very much for joining this evening.
Thank you.
And Gail, look forward to seeing you soon. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.